You know, there's something rather peculiar that happens when you begin to wake up, and I don't mean simply opening your eyes in the morning. I mean waking up from the grand sleep of believing that you are merely a small creature, cast adrift in a vast, indifferent universe. The moment that veil begins to thin, the moment you start to see that this whole affair of being alive is not happening to you but as you, something quite strange begins to unfold. You find that life no longer feels like a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. You see, most of us are trained from birth to treat existence as a kind of project, a ladder to climb, a mountain to conquer, a riddle to decode. We imagine there's something waiting for us at the end of the journey. Salvation, enlightenment, success, peace. But when the awakening stirs, you begin to sense that there is no ladder, no summit, and no prize apart from the very climb itself. And when this realization dawns, the world you thought you knew starts to shimmer and change. It's like watching a play and suddenly remembering that you are not merely in the audience, but part of the cast, and even more curiously, that you are also the stage, the lights, and the whole theater. Everything you see is you in disguise. The people you love, the ones you dislike, the bird outside your window, the raindrop sliding down the glass, all of it. One continuous dance of yourself pretending not to know itself. And when this truth hits, when it really hits, you can't help but laugh, because it's both the grandest revelation and the oldest joke in the world. Now, this laughter isn't always comfortable for those around you, because while you're beginning to glimpse that life is play, most people are still very much invested in the seriousness of their roles. They've forgotten that the tragedy and comedy are written by the same hand. When you start smiling in the middle of their drama, they look at you as if you've lost your mind, and in a way, you have. You've lost the mind that believed the game was all there was. This is the peculiar consequence of waking up. You don't quite fit anymore. Not because you're superior, but because the costume doesn't cling the way it used to. The mask begins to feel heavy, the dialogue rehearsed, the applause unnecessary. And yet, there you are, still on the stage, still surrounded by other players who are taking their lines very seriously indeed. You can't just walk off. You must learn to play with awareness, to dance, while knowing it's a dance. But of course, when you no longer tremble at the villains or cheer at the heroes, the rest of the audience begins to grow uneasy. They whisper, "He's changed." And they're right. Something within you has seen through the painted scenery. You can still admire the artistry, still enjoy the show, but you can no longer believe it's real in the way you once did. You've discovered, to your quiet amusement, that the whole production is a magnificent illusion, not a lie, mind you, but a kind of divine pretending. And that's the odd thing about awakening. It doesn't separate you from the world. It dissolves the walls that made separation possible. But to those who are still dreaming, your calm looks like detachment, your laughter sounds like mockery, and your peace feels like absence. They can't quite place what's changed, only that something invisible has shifted. They sense that you're no longer trapped in the same shared seriousness, and that threatens the dream. So, awakening has this unintended side effect. It unsettles the sleepers. Not because you mean to, but because truth, by its very nature, shakes illusions simply by being seen. When you are no longer hypnotized by the game, those still under its spell feel your stillness as disruption. And yet, this disturbance is love in disguise, for every awakening stirs another, just as a single yawn spreads through a room. So don't be surprised if the first ripple of enlightenment is loneliness. You've begun to hear the faint laughter of the universe, and it sounds foreign to those still rehearsing their lines. But take heart that laughter is the sound of coming home. You see, my friends, human beings are marvelous actors, perhaps the finest in the universe. We spend our days performing elaborate roles, And the most astonishing part is that we've managed to convince ourselves the play is reality itself. From childhood, we're given a script, who we should be, what we should value, where we ought to go. And so, without even realizing it, we sign a most peculiar contract, the social contract of pretending. This contract says, let's all agree to take the game seriously. Let's agree that some days are dreadful and others divine, that success means climbing some invisible ladder, that being someone matters more than simply being. We promise to believe that security lies in things that can be lost, money, reputation, approval, and that if we follow the rules long enough, happiness will eventually grant us an audience. But when you begin to awaken, you start to notice the fine print of this contract. You see that every player nods and smiles, pretending to understand what nobody really understands. You hear people complain about their burdens, boast of their victories, grieve their losses, yet underneath it all is the same quiet whisper, am I doing this right? We perform to each other, reassuring one another that the stage is solid, that the props are real, that the curtain will never fall. Now, there's nothing wrong with the play itself. The problem arises when we forget that it is a play. And so, we get tangled in our costumes. We mistake the mask for the face. We begin to compete over who can pretend most convincingly. Even our suffering becomes a badge of honor, proof that we're taking the drama seriously. But you, the one who's begun to wake up, can no longer keep a straight face. You see through the make-believe. You watch people rushing to work as though the world might end if they arrived 5 minutes late, and you think, how marvelous that we believe such things. You hear the endless chatter about success and failure, and you realize they're two sides of the same imaginary coin. You look at the way people cling to opinions as if their very lives depended on them, and you can't help but smile gently, because you remember when you did the same. And this smile, oh, this quiet smile, it is the moment the contract begins to crumble. Because in the unspoken agreement of mutual seriousness, laughter is rebellion. To laugh at the play is to remind the other actors that it's all pretend. And that's very unsettling to those still lost in their roles. They may accuse you of not caring, of being detached or irresponsible, but you see, you care more deeply than ever before. You've simply stopped believing that anxiety is proof of importance. When you no longer share in the collective panic, when you no longer echo the rehearsed lines of fear and ambition, something remarkable happens. The social mask no longer fits. You begin to speak more honestly, act more freely, and love more sincerely. But sincerity, in a world built on performance, is a dangerous thing. It exposes the fiction everyone depends upon. People begin to sense that you're no longer hypnotized, and that makes them uneasy because your freedom reminds them of their own chains. This then is the cost of awakening. You quietly withdraw your signature from the contract. You stop pretending. You don't denounce the play. You simply stop mistaking it for life. And suddenly, many of the conversations that once felt natural begin to sound hollow. You notice how people trade small talk like coins of reassurance. Busy day? Can you believe the weather? Not because they have anything to say, but because silence feels unbearable. You see the desperation in this need to fill the void, and instead of judging it, you feel compassion. You understand that it's fear of emptiness that keeps the whole performance running. But once you've glimpsed what lies beyond the noise, that vast, open awareness in which all the chatter arises and dissolves, you can't go back to pretending. You can still play along, yes, but you play lightly, like a musician, improvising within the melody. You laugh with the actors, you cry with them too, but somewhere deep inside, you know that it's only a dance of appearances. And so the contract ends, not with a protest, but with a gentle awakening. You realize there was never any punishment for breaking the rules, because the rules were written in chalk on water. They vanish the moment you stop fearing their authority. When you see this clearly, you are free to love the world without being trapped by it, to join the game, but to do so knowingly, joyfully, playfully. And perhaps, just perhaps, your lightness will inspire another actor to forget their lines for a moment, to laugh mid-scene, and to remember, ah yes, this is all a magnificent pretend. Now, when one begins to wake up from the dream, the strangest thing occurs. The world, which once seemed perfectly ordinary, begins to behave rather oddly. It's as if you've stopped dancing to a tune that everyone else still hears, and suddenly the dancers around you are looking quite puzzled. They can't understand why your feet have gone still, why you no longer sway to the same rhythm of worry and ambition. And so, because they cannot comprehend what has changed, they do what the ego always does when it feels threatened. It projects. You see, most people are not disturbed by you, they're disturbed by what you reflect back to them. Your calm becomes a mirror for their restlessness. Your silence echoes their noise. Your refusal to play the game reminds them that they too are pretending. And this, my friends, the ego cannot bear. Because the ego survives only through comparison. It must be smarter than someone, richer than someone, holier than someone. Always someone else is required to sustain the fiction of me. So when you no longer participate in this competition, it confuses the egoic mind. It says, what's wrong with him? Why isn't he upset about the things that matter? What it really means is, why isn't he reinforcing my story? And so, unconsciously, people begin to project their own disquiet onto you. They say, you've become distant, when what they mean is, your stillness makes me uneasy. They say, you've changed, when what they mean is, you've stopped pretending. But you haven't withdrawn love, you've simply withdrawn illusion. And that distinction is crucial, because most of our so-called love is conditional upon agreement. I love you, we say, as long as you validate my dream. When you no longer validate it, when your presence begins to unravel the narrative they've built about themselves, love quickly turns into irritation, suspicion, even hostility. That's projection in action. They attribute to you the discomfort of their own awakening. Now, the temptation for the half-awake is to retaliate, to correct, to preach, to defend the peace you've found. But you must see that's merely the ego's shadow trying on new robes. You cannot awaken others by argument any more than you can make someone taste sugar by describing sweetness. Awakening, you see, is contagious only by presence. The Buddha never converted a single soul. He simply sat still, and those ready to stir found themselves reflected in his silence. So when others grow defensive, understand that it is not personal. The noise you hear is the sound of identity shattering, and identity never dies quietly. The ego defends itself with blame. You're cold, you're arrogant, you think you're better. But you know it isn't superiority that separates you, it's transparency. You're not above them. You simply stopped pretending there was a them and a you to begin with. Think of it like sunlight shining through a dusty room. The dust dances not because the sun intrudes, but because it reveals what was already floating there all along. Your presence has the same effect. You don't make people uneasy. Their uneasiness was always present. You've just illuminated it. And if they mistake your light for offense, it is only because they have not yet remembered that they are made of the same radiance. Here's the paradox. The more deeply awake you become, the more invisible you must be. Not in hiding, but in humility. You no longer assert yourself as the wise one or the teacher. You simply allow people their dreams because you understand that every dream has its purpose. The nightmare, too, has its necessity. Some people need the tension of the illusion before they can release it. And so, when they project their fear upon you, the kindest response is not explanation, but stillness. The awakened one meets projection with compassion, not defense. You don't need to prove your clarity to anyone, because truth doesn't shout, it resonates. Over time, some will sense it and draw nearer, others will retreat. Both are perfectly fine. The ocean loses nothing, whether the wave crashes against it or dissolves into it. And so, your task is simple: to remain open, to see that every accusation, every misunderstanding, every projection that comes your way is just consciousness in disguise, trying, in its own clumsy way, to recognize itself. When you see that, compassion flows naturally. You stop taking offense. You stop needing to be understood, because you understand deeply that what they're resisting is not you at all. They're resisting their own awakening. This is the great irony of spiritual life. Your light will draw some hearts closer and drive others away. But in both cases, the light is doing its work. The ego flees from what exposes it. Yet, that very flight is part of its eventual dissolution. Every reaction against truth is truth knocking louder on the door. So when the world seems to turn its back, smile gently. For you are not being rejected, you are being refined. What appears as conflict is only consciousness rearranging itself into a new order of seeing. And soon, even the projections fade. And you recognize that the one who was triggered and the one who was blamed were never two different people at all. It was the same life, playing hide and seek with itself. You know, there's something about silence that terrifies people. It shouldn't, but it does. The moment a conversation falls quiet, watch what happens. Hands reach for phones, feet shuffle, someone clears their throat and says, "So, how's the weather?" Anything at all, to fill the gap. Why? Because silence is not empty, it's full. It's full of everything we've been avoiding hearing. Silence, you see, is the great revealer. It doesn't scold or criticize. It simply holds up a mirror, and in that mirror, we begin to see ourselves without our favorite disguises. In silence, there is nowhere to hide. The persona, the social act, the confident smile, all of it begins to crumble. Not because silence destroys, but because it reveals. When one awakens, one grows strangely comfortable with silence. It becomes like an old friend. You find yourself sitting with others and realizing that words are often unnecessary, that the real communion happens in the space between the sentences. But to those still caught in the noise, your quiet presence feels like a void, and that void frightens them. They sense the depth of it, and depth demands honesty. Most people are terrified of honesty, not because it's cruel, but because it's naked. Silence makes them feel exposed, as though their whole identity might dissolve if the talking stops. And in a sense, that's true. The ego lives in noise. It needs motion, opinion, chatter, the hum of its own self-importance. Silence is its undoing, its mirror. For in silence, there's no applause, no argument, no echo, just being. When you bring that silence into the world, people feel it. They may not understand it, but they feel it, and some will squirm, because your stillness awakens their restlessness. It reminds them of the vastness within themselves that they've tried to forget. And so, unconsciously, they rush to fill the void between you with words. They mistake your quiet for disinterest, your pause for judgment. But really, it is compassion, for silence is the language of understanding. Have you noticed how two people who love each other deeply can sit for hours without saying a word, and yet feel utterly connected? That's not awkwardness, that's communion. In silence, two consciousnesses meet directly, without translation, without the interference of thought. The chatter of the mind subsides, and what remains is presence, simple, unadorned, luminous. But society, bless its heart, has taught us that silence is rude. We've been trained to treat it as an absence that must be filled, and so we drown the sacred with the trivial. We trade the symphony of being for the static of commentary. The awakened person, however, begins to hear the music again, the silence behind all sounds, the stillness within all motion. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of awareness itself. And when you begin to live from that silence, you find that you no longer need to be the loudest voice in the room. You don't need to convince or convert. Your very presence becomes a teaching. You can sit with someone and let the quiet do the talking, because silence, when genuine, is not passive. It's alive, vibrating with understanding. It doesn't demand agreement, it invites realization. Of course, to the untrained ear, that silence can feel unbearable. It exposes the hum of anxiety we've mistaken for living. That's why we fill our days with music, television, conversation, noise, anything to avoid meeting the quiet, for the quiet holds the truth. But when you finally stop resisting it, you discover that silence was never your enemy. It was your home all along. So, the spiritually awake person becomes a kind of still lake. Others come and gaze into it, and they see their own reflection. Some will find it beautiful and serene. Others will find it unsettling, even intolerable. But the lake doesn't judge. It just reflects. And that's the secret of silence. It shows things as they are. And if you listen deeply enough, you'll realize that silence isn't opposed to sound. It's what gives sound its meaning. Music, after all, is not just the notes, but the spaces between them. Life, too, is made meaningful by the pauses, the quiet moments between all our doing. When you can rest there, when you can abide in that infinite hush without needing to decorate it with words, then you have discovered what the sages called peace, not the peace of escape, but the peace that allows everything to arise and fall without resistance. So, when your silence makes others nervous, smile. For you are not withholding yourself. You are offering the deepest part of yourself, the part that needs no explanation. You are showing them the mirror of being, clear and still. And whether they look away or look within, the reflection remains. You know, the most disorienting thing about awakening is not that the world changes, but that the meaning of the world changes. Everything is still here, the streets, the conversations, the familiar faces, and yet something essential has dissolved. The scaffolding of belief that held the whole thing together begins to crumble, and suddenly the symbols, the stories, the great and little dramas of human life seem strangely transparent. It's rather like realizing that the menu is not the meal. For years, we've been eating words, success, failure, progress, sin, virtue, mistaking them for nourishment. But the moment you awaken, you see that these words are only labels floating on the surface of something immeasurable. The concept of Monday or next year or status becomes almost comical. They are agreements, useful perhaps, but imaginary all the same. Most human conversation, you see, is a form of reassurance. We're constantly whispering to each other, yes, this is real. Yes, we know what's going on. We talk about the weather, about politics, about our plans and fears, all as a way of confirming that the shared story is still intact. But when you awaken, you can no longer quite believe in that story. You hear the words, but the music behind them has gone flat. You nod, you smile, but somewhere inside, you're aware that none of it quite touches the mystery. And that can be profoundly lonely at first, because shared meaning is the glue that holds human society together. When it begins to dissolve, you feel like a ghost among the living, speaking a language that no longer carries weight. You can't unsee what you've seen. The ladder everyone's climbing doesn't lead anywhere. The trophies are made of smoke. The promises of someday shimmer like mirages on a desert road. But don't mistake this collapse for despair. It's the beginning of freedom. For when the counterfeit coins of borrowed meaning lose their shine, you begin to discover a deeper currency, the direct experience of the present. The taste of your tea, the movement of your breath, the sound of rain against a window, these simple things, unnoticed before, now shimmer with significance. Not symbolic significance, but the sacredness of the real. You realize that meaning was never in the words, but in the being. A flower does not need to declare its purpose. Its very blooming is its meaning. The sun does not ask, "Why do I shine?" It shines because that is its nature. Likewise, you find that life has no external justification. It is its own delight, its own expression. And when this understanding dawns, the world returns not as a prison of definitions, but as a play of wonder. The conversations of others, once dull and repetitive, now sound like music again, because you no longer demand that they mean something beyond themselves. You can listen without judgment, laugh without analysis, and speak without needing to persuade. You have discovered that meaning, like water, cannot be held. It must be tasted directly. Of course, others may still cling to the old interpretations. They will tell you what life should mean, what success must look like, and why your peace is dangerous. Let them, for every soul awakens in its own season. You need not correct anyone. You need only live the truth quietly, and your very being will whisper what words cannot. The collapse of shared meaning is not the end of understanding, it is the end of misunderstanding. It is the moment the mind stops pretending to know. And in that pause, something vast and wordless begins to sing through you. You no longer seek meaning, you are meaning. Manifest as this moment, this breath, this heartbeat. And once you've felt that, truly felt it, all the philosophies in the world seem like children's drawings of the sky. Beautiful, sincere, but incomplete. The sky itself, that infinite silence in which all clouds come and go, that's the truth. And you are not under it, or in it, or apart from it. You are it. You know, once you begin to wake up, you discover that compassion changes shape. It's no longer the kind of compassion that rushes in to rescue people from their dreams. It's not the pity that says, "Poor you, let me fix your life." It's a gentler, quieter compassion, one that sees the dream for what it is and loves it without believing it. You realize that everyone, yourself included, is playing an intricate game of pretending to be this person with this story in this world of struggle and hope. And there's nothing wrong with that. The universe needs the play. It delights in it. But you can no longer join in quite the same way, because you see that trying to save another is often just the ego changing costumes, playing the role of the enlightened helper. Now, this is one of the hardest lessons, because you look around and you see people suffering, chasing illusions, exhausting themselves for shadows. And every instinct says, "I must tell them, I must wake them." But the wiser part of you begins to laugh softly, because you remember that no one can wake another. You can only be awake yourself. And sometimes being awake is the greatest act of love you can offer. The Buddha, you know, never went door to door knocking with pamphlets. He simply sat under a tree, utterly himself, and those who were ready felt something stir within them. That's how true compassion works. It doesn't interfere, it resonates. It doesn't convert, it invites. And so, The awakened person learns to let people dream their necessary dreams. You begin to see that suffering, too, has its sacred purpose. You suffered until you were ready to see through it, and so will they. You can hold their pain tenderly without mistaking it for tragedy. You can love the one who is lost without needing to hand them a map. For the path is not a line on the ground. It's the slow remembering of where they already are. You start to notice that much of what we call compassion is really fear of discomfort, of watching someone hurt, of feeling helpless. But real compassion is fearless. It trusts the unfolding. It knows that the seed cracks before it flowers, and that the breaking is not a mistake but the very doorway to growth. And yet, there is a subtler test here: how to love without collusion. Because most people don't want truth. They want validation. They want someone to tell them that their stories are real, their enemies justified, their wounds special. But you can no longer do that. You cannot, in good conscience, keep feeding the dream. Instead, you learn a different way of loving, one that says, I see you, and I see through you. I see the divine masquerading as your confusion, and I bow to both. You don't indulge the illusion, but neither do you attack it. You hold it in awareness, knowing that it too is part of the dance. And sometimes that very neutrality is misunderstood. People may say, you don't care, but oh, you care more deeply than they can imagine. You just no longer care in the way the world defines it. You no longer care against what is. You care with it fully, openly, without resistance. That is why the awakened heart seems paradoxical. It weeps and laughs at once. It knows that all pain is temporary, and all joy is fleeting, and that behind both lies the same stillness. To love like this is to live without agenda. You no longer love in order to change someone, or heal them, or be loved in return. You love because it is your nature to do so, just as the sun shines or the river flows. Your love no longer depends on outcome, and that, you see, is true compassion. It asks for nothing, it possesses nothing, it leaves no trace. When you embody this kind of love, you stop being a participant in the world's dramas. You become a mirror. Others come before you, playing their parts, speaking their lines, and the mirror reflects only what is no praise, no blame, no distortion. And in that reflection, some catch a glimpse of their own essence, and something in them softens, even if they can't name why. This is the silent teaching of presence, compassion without collusion. You don't add fuel to anyone's illusion, nor do you extinguish it by force. You simply stand as a witness, radiating the quiet certainty that everything, even confusion, belongs. And perhaps after a while, someone will ask, what is it about you that feels so peaceful? And you might smile and say, nothing at all, because what they sense is not something you do, but what you've stopped doing. You've stopped trying to manage the universe. You've stopped confusing love with control. You've allowed life to be what it is, infinitely mysterious, gloriously imperfect, and always, always whole. That is compassion without collusion, the willingness to see truth everywhere, even in the illusion, and to love the illusion because it is truth playing dress-up. And now we come to the most mischievous trick of all, the final hiding place of the ego. You see, the ego is a master of disguise. It will surrender anything except the throne. It will renounce wealth, status, pleasure, even humility, if only it can claim, I am the one who has renounced them. And so when you awaken, when the illusion of the little self begins to dissolve, the ego slips out the back door, changes costumes, and reappears wearing the halo of spirituality. It says, ah, at last I am enlightened. And you can almost hear it polishing its new identity. The same old game, but now it's playing saint instead of sinner, sage instead of fool. It's subtle, terribly subtle. For even as you laugh at the world's illusions, a quiet voice begins to whisper, yes, but I see through it. I'm different. I've arrived. And there it is again, the I, peeking through the cracks in the temple wall. Now, don't condemn it. Don't wage war on it. To fight the ego is just another ego trip. The real art is to notice it, to smile, and to see that it's perfectly natural. The self cannot help trying to define itself. It's like fire trying not to burn. But when you see the game clearly, it loses its grip. You begin to enjoy its antics without being fooled by them. The sages have always warned of this stage. They called it spiritual pride, or the stink of enlightenment. But it's not a sin, it's just another wave rising in the ocean. The mistake is only in thinking that this wave is somehow the ocean itself. The ocean laughs and says, my dear, you have never been anything but me. So the deeper awakening is realizing that there is no one to be awakened. There is only awakening happening endlessly in everything. Even your moments of confusion, even your lapses into old patterns, they too are part of it. You can't step outside of the dance to claim authorship, because the moment you do, you're back in costume. It's rather like catching yourself smiling in a dream and suddenly realizing that the dreamer and the dream are the same being. There's no need to wake the dreamer, because the dream is the waking. And this recognition brings with it a kind of cosmic laughter, the laughter of freedom. You laugh because the whole pursuit of ego death turns out to be another act in the play. You laugh because even your most solemn efforts to transcend yourself were never separate from the total perfection of what already is. So you relax. You stop trying to maintain your awakened identity. You stop announcing, even inwardly, that you've transcended the ego. You allow the personality to return, like an old friend, still imperfect, still full of quirks, but now transparent. You use it as you would a costume in a play, to speak, to love, to interact. But you no longer mistake it for who you are. When you stumble, when you get irritated, when you catch yourself judging or boasting, you simply notice it with affection. Ah, there's the old rascal again. And in that gentle humor, the ego's last fortress dissolves. The great paradox, you see, is that the true no-ego is not an absence of self, but a freedom from believing in the self. The mask remains, but it no longer hides anything. Life moves through you as through a flute, nothing to resist, nothing to defend. And the melody that comes is not yours, it's the universe singing itself. And once you taste that, you stop trying to be enlightened. You stop trying to be anything. You let yourself be ordinary gloriously, utterly ordinary, and that is when the extraordinary begins to shine through everything. And so, after all this, after the laughter, the seeing, the dissolving of all your certainties, you find yourself right back where you started. You wake up, stretch, pour your tea, pay your bills, answer emails, hold a friend's hand, sit in traffic. Nothing has changed, and yet everything has changed. The world hasn't vanished, it's still the same play, but you are no longer bound by your part in it. You know it's a play, and that knowledge transforms the entire performance into a dance. You see, the spiritually awake person does not retire to some distant mountain and wait for the curtain to fall. No, he or she returns to the marketplace, to the noise, to the hum of life, carrying the stillness like a secret fragrance. You re-enter society, but not as a participant in its frenzy, rather as an artist, improvising lightly, aware of the rhythm but no longer enslaved by it. You play your role fully, but you don't believe your role defines you. You can be the teacher, the lover, the fool, the beggar, the friend, and through it all, you remain free. Now, to those still asleep, this freedom looks peculiar. They see your calm and call it detachment. They see your laughter and think it's irreverence. They see your ease with impermanence and imagine that you don't care. But you do care deeply, only not in the way they expect. You no longer love people as characters in their stories. You love them as facets of yourself. You see that every face is your own reflection, every joy and sorrow a ripple of the same infinite sea. You begin to understand what the mystics meant when they said, "The world is my body." When someone weeps, you feel it in your chest. When someone smiles, the warmth moves through your own hands. The separation between self and other softens until compassion becomes effortless, not a virtue, but a simple recognition. There is only this. And because you know this, you no longer need to fix anyone or prove anything. You stop trying to convince others of your awakening. You don't talk much about it at all. Because you see that everyone is the universe in disguise, pretending to be asleep, until they grow tired of pretending. You realize that even the sleeper plays a sacred part. Without the sleeping, there could be no awakening. Without the dream, no dreamer. So you stop dividing the world into enlightened and unenlightened, spiritual and worldly, wise and foolish. It's all one dance, spinning between opposites, like day and night. Now you can laugh again, freely, wholeheartedly, because the seriousness has evaporated. You laugh not to mock the world, but to celebrate it. You laugh because the cosmic play is endlessly creative, endlessly absurd, and endlessly beautiful. And in your laughter, there's love for everything, even the madness, even the mess, especially the mess. You see, living among the sleeping doesn't mean standing apart. It means moving among them with the understanding that everyone is exactly where they need to be. You smile at their struggles because you recognize your own old disguises in them. You meet their anger with patience, their confusion with silence, their questions with presence. You stop trying to wake them and instead simply be awake. And this is the final paradox. Awakening doesn't remove you from the dream. It lets you dream knowingly. You can still enjoy the movie, cry at its sorrows, cheer its joys, and yet somewhere inside, you remember it's light on a screen. The awakened person lives as though life were a great improvisation, saying yes to every note, even the dissonant ones, because all of it belongs to the music. So you dance, not to reach a destination, not to impress the other dancers, but because the rhythm moves through you and you can't help but move with it. You dance knowing the song will end. And that's what makes it precious. You dance with those who are still lost in their steps, not to correct them, but to remind them that the joy was never in getting it right, it was in moving at all. And when the music fades, when friends come and go, when age creases the body, when death comes tapping at the door, you no longer resist. You bow gracefully, smiling at the grand finale. For you have seen the secret. There is no finale. The dancer and the dance were never two. The curtain closes only to rise again, in another form, in another face, in another breath. And you, dear listener, are that breath, the universe, inhaling itself, exhaling into form, laughing through billions of eyes. You are not merely a part of it, you are it, pretending for a little while to be separate, just for the fun of rediscovering that you never were. So go on, play your part, speak your lines, love your people, live your days. But never forget the laughter behind the curtain, the silence beneath the sound. That is where you truly are and have always been.